Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to the Occult Explorers. I'm your hostess, Snappy, and I'm joined, as always, by my good friend Dion. How's it going, Dion?
Life is good. Glad to be here.
Right? It's a beautiful day, and we're here for part two of our Deseret Mystery of the Hive. Now, this one I'm super excited about because Mormon history is American history, and it gets super deep and super crazy. And what's really cool about this particular talk and this time is that we want to go even deeper than a lot of people do with Mormonism. So normally when people are discussing Mormonism, we start with its founder, John Smith. And there's no disputing him as the founder, but Dion wants to make deeper connections. Deeper connections to the greater culture of America and all the way back to England and to the Smith family in general, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, when we're talking about great people in history, we know there's always people behind them. Their wives, a mother, a father, a teacher, a mentor. There's somebody behind them. So with that theory or thinking, a lot of the research we started doing was looking at who was his father, who was his mother. That's how it starts. But then I wasn't happy just with that. We wanted to go as far back as I could.
Right, and I remember when we were talking, you kept saying we were saying like, okay, if this isn't inspired doctrine, right? It's got to come from somewhere, right? Is Smith just pulling it out of his hat? And what you found was quite shocking. No, he's not pulling out of his hat, not at all. This is an entire cultural movement, right?
And just to let you know, I didn't find nothing. There are so many great Mormon researchers out there. Just to throw this out there. That's where all this information is coming from. It's
Right.
just digging into this work of these authors that are blacklisted or blackballed. They don't get much airplay in time because they have an uncomfortable truth or set of data that they're talking about.
Well, just in general, historians don't get paid a lot of money. There isn't money to write these kind of academic works. And then you have to confront the reality of the Mormon Church, which is one of the largest corporations in America. And I'm calling it a corporation because that's what it is first and foremost. And they throw their money around, and especially a lot of these people we've been looking at, there are incredible researchers, but they're not academics in the traditional sense. So you put that into it as well. And, like you said, people are getting sidelined. But luckily, there are amazing publications and programs. Like we were checking out Mormon Stories for a lot of the work on this one and a lot of their sites. And they've been doing some just mind-blowing work in this field.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So, I thought, well, we got the grandfather. Who was the first Smith to set foot? And where did they get this information from? Where's all this stuff coming from? So, and you could take it back as far as you want to go. At a certain point, I had to put on the brakes and go, okay. Once I got to Sir Walter Raleigh and James Dean, people like that, I'm like, we've gone far enough back.
Wow, John D.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk about that in another episode. But so today we'll even talk a little Sir Walter Raleigh. But let's go to the first pick. Get this party started.
Oh, and always, we just want to give a little bit of a trigger warning. This episode is going to be talking about drugs and sexual abuse. Mormon history is human history, and it's dark, my friends. So, yeah.
Politics. And not only do we get into politics, now we get into over the sea, our friends over the sea, because that's where this picture is, over the pond. Actually, I'm saying it wrong. Our friends on the other side of the pond there, Lincolnshire.
Yeah, so what is this that we're looking at here, Dion?
It's a church in Lincolnshire, England. And in 1300, it was the tallest building on the planet Earth.
That's incredible. Cool.
And it was the seat of the church at the time in England there. Originally started off as with the Ninth Legion. You've heard of the famous Ninth Legion?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's lots of mysteries in occultism with the Ninth Legion. As a fort, Roman fort. Years later, Danish settlement with the Danes. And then even later, William the Conqueror, 1066 around there. They started building. And what's interesting, the name Lincoln, or Lincolnshire, comes from Linden Colonia. And it was a Linden colony, what it meant. And Linden was like a castle up on the rock overlooking water or pond or pool. And Lincoln's very special. Lincolnshire is very special. This is, where Joseph Smith's peoples come from, as well as a lot of stuff, history in England. Like they got the oldest house that's lived in, inhabited up to this day, the oldest arch that you can drive through, a lot of oldest first things there. And part of it is, like I said, a Danish settlement and the Vikings, they came over. Some of the words like Willoughby is a town there. And the ending is B at the end from willow trees, and farmstead at B, Willoughby. Our gate at the end for names of streets. And these come from like the Norman stuff. And so there's levels of history here in this area. It's been inhabited for a long time.
So we have mythology. Just thinking about it, we got the Welsh, we got the Celts, we got the Romans, we have the Vikings, and then later we have the modern English people.
Oh yeah, it's special. We're gonna have to ask Old Boy about this spot. I'm sure he knows this. This is his backyard right here.
Got our buddy Old Boy. He is studying the British Isles and a lot of Welsh culture. Incredible channel. We love you, Old Boy.
Oh yeah. And so it's out of Lincolnshire that Joseph Smith's, it was called Sutterton, which is 10 to 15, 20 miles from Willoughby, where you had Lord Willoughby, later on Marquis de Willoughby. And that's where you have a personage called John Smith comes out of, the Admiral John Smith of New England. And here we're going to get into the first colonies in America.
I was going to say, that's a name I recognize from sort of modern American mythology,
Yeah. And this, normally we're taught Plymouth Rock in our culture here, and how the Native Americans were so excited when the colonists pulled up that they made them a turkey Thanksgiving, so grateful there, which wasn't the truth, obviously. And before Plymouth Rock, you had the Roanoke colony, Sir Walter Raleigh. This is about 1590s, somewhere around there. And
Roanoke is really kind of interesting and terrifying because didn't all those people go missing? And isn't where that word was carved into the tree? And no one really knows what it means, Roanoke.
Yeah, well, so they set up a settlement there. And part of it is through a royal charter. And now we're going to get into how this is going to connect to Mormonism. Because it's a bigger story we're telling. It's not just about Mormonism. It's about the Smith family. It's about theology. It's about magic plates. It's about a lot of history, and
colonialism, right?
Yeah. So the Roanoke colony goes missing and so with Indians, it's about the Native Americans. We know this. Our starvation, but literally there's no signs of them when they pull up. So back here in England, they form some companies. This is about the time they want to come colonize America. That was the first colony that failed. And so they want to go out there and explore what happened to those people. Where did they go? And let's set up a new colony. And it's at this time we get something called the Virginia Company. Because we see Virginia as a state in America, but that was a company in Virginia for the Queen, the Virgin Queen. And it was a company of shareholders coming. And one of the persons that they got to be on the boat, Captain John Smith of Lincolnshire, 10 miles away from Robert Smith, which is the great-great-great-grandparent of Joseph Smith, in this town there in England, with the tallest spires there at the time. And that was the seat of the church, a lot of history. This guy was famous right here, John Smith. If we can go to the first picture, if you can skip back, and we'll show you John Smith right here.
Well,
even better.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, we can go to this one here. Sorry.
There he is. There's John Smith, the dashing fellow.
Right, and he's actually even well known within Canada as well. Like he's kind of there's tons of movies written about him and his history with Pocahontas and that whole BS mythologized account.
Wait, so come on, wait, leave it there. So what they want to tell you, John Smith, that's his monument. All right, what they want to tell you is that Pocahontas fell in love with them, and it's like Disney somehow can spin this into a romance story. An 11-year-old getting raped and abused and used as a pawn, political pawn between England and Native American tribes. And Disney says that's a romance story.
Right.
No.
It's a nightmare story. I actually know quite a bit about it, but
is there anything you want to say? If you want to say something, tell us.
Well, we should talk a little bit about that, just because it irritates me how little people know about the real Pocahontas and John Smith story. So Pocahontas, she wasn't a princess in the sense that we understand princesses, okay, or the way that she was depicted. She was the daughter of a chief, and this particular chief was of the Powhatan tribe, and they were trying to maintain sort of like an authority. He was a local tribal leader, and he wanted to put the colony of John Smith under his control. So there was kind of like ongoing spats, and at one point John Smith gets kidnapped. And in the earliest of accounts by John Smith, there's no mention of Pocahontas. He actually, in his earliest accounts, said he never even encountered her at that time. And the story goes, he gets confronted with the chief, and they battle it out, and some goods are exchanged between the two colonies, and Smith goes free. And then what ends up happening later is Pocahontas gets kidnapped by the colony as a way to try and broker trade, because they keep expanding. And the Powhatans do not like this English colony expanding, and they understand that they're not going to be officially under their command, and Pocahontas never marries or has anything really to do with John Smith. She winds up, after she gets abducted, they force her to be baptized. They give her the name Rebecca, and then she gets married off to this guy, James Rolfe, and then she winds up having kids with Rolfe, and she becomes kind of a figure of peace, because she was seen as sort of a uniting of the two colonies between the Powhatans and the English settlement there. And then at one point, her husband takes Pocahontas to England, and she's paraded around like a princess, put in finery. She's documented attending several big state dinners. And then she catches an illness while in England and dies. And that's really her story. And this is all happening between the ages of like 9 and 13 for this poor girl. She's a political pawn.
Disney Pocahontas, come on.
Right? And that story we have actually comes, so what happens is John Smith later, because he becomes kind of, you probably get into this, but he becomes kind of a notorious charlatan. He writes a lot of kind of fake stuff and puffs up himself, and he had a bunch of failed company exploits. And in his later life, when he was trying to punch up his own story, he connected it to Pocahontas, because she had caught sort of like she caught the country by storm, this idea of a Native American princess, right? It was novel and powerful. So Smith rewrites his story when he first meets the Powhatan chief. Now, all of a sudden, the Powhatan chief wants to put him through this ritual murder where they're going to cut his head off. And then Pocahontas comes and throws herself and saves him. None of that probably happened, probably all just made up by Smith. I have read one account where an anthropologist argued that maybe there was a ritual that Smith went through that was supposed to be an adoption ritual, where he was dead and reborn and then adopted into the Powhatan tribe. But again, not connected to Pocahontas. He only mentions her much later. But yeah, I just wanted to set that record straight.
No, that is true. I came across that. He is an interesting character. The reason they picked him to be the admiral of New England and for this colony was he had a lot of history fighting. He fought, just so you know, this monument right here originally had 3 Transylvanian heads on it, because he was knighted by Prince Bathory of Transylvania. Before he ever came to the colony in America, that's where part of his reputation came from, was fighting Turks. And
so he's the Knight of Dracula? Is he in the Order of Dragons?
Yeah, Prince Bathory of Transylvania knighted John Smith, the admiral, who was helping, that came from Lincolnshire. And so this is a movement of people and Smiths that are coming from a certain area to America, to these colonies. And so this company we say it's a colony, but it's a company first. It's a royal charter. They got a royal charter from James. That's why it's King James, Jamestown. And he said you could have your company to go over there and set up goods and trade and make a colony. And up the river, they are up the water there. They had the Massachusetts Bay Colony as well, where Robert Smith lands. And this is in the same time periods. This is like 20 years later, 15 years later, he's landing. So, there's more to Jamestown. Just before we let that go and John Smith, there was cannibalism in Jamestown. That's famous. They talk about that. Because when John Smith left and went back to England, things got out of hand. Because he was a kind of a stiff ruler of the colony, but he helped make it work. He kept it going, kept it afloat.
Done kind of thing.
Yeah. And when he left, things got bad. And because they built the colony on a marsh, not a smart spot, and they weren't in tight with the Native Americans, and things fell out, they started starving. By the time they came back, they noticed that there was some cannibalism going on. They had ate rats. They were down to everything, and you could type in that. And one of the other famous things about Jamestown is the Jamestown brides. I don't know. Let's hit the next picture.
Yeah, I've heard of this, but I'm not too familiar. What is the Jamestown brides?
And there's Pocahontas. There's an old representation of Pocahontas right there. She doesn't look 11.
No.
Oh, right there. There's the Jamestown's brides. Yeah. So at a certain point, the men outnumbered the women there, like 8-1. And in England, they put together a system where they paid these mail order brides and paid brides to go to Jamestown. And they're known as the famous Jamestown brides. And some had dowries, some were paid, and they put them on boats and sent them to the colony there through the Virginia Company. This is a company, a corporate royal charter. And at a certain point, not only is John Smith the head of this colony, Thomas Smith is the accountant back in England for the Virginia Company. And so, they have a competitor. And their competitor is the Massachusetts Bay Company. And it's on that the people that come there, they sit on mass, and they're puritanical. Whereas the ones in Jamestown are based off the king. The ones in Mass are more puritanical. What's ironic is the area where both John Smith and Robert Smith come from is close to the Boston, England. Like they said at Boston there, but there's a Boston in Lincolnshire as well.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff we're going to find is coming from Lincolnshire in terms of people, money, resources, theology, churches, doctrines. What happened was the revolution.
Right.
That's what happened. So let's hit the next picture.
That's interesting, right? Yeah, and I know that England kicked out all the Puritans and sent them to America, right? That was such a huge thing.
And so they come to Massachusetts, and they're more puritanical, and they even have witch trials. Things happen because when you trace back Joseph Smith's relatives, the farthest you go back is Robert Smith. And Robert Smith is from Lincolnshire, like I said, about 10, 15 miles away from Willoughby, where John Smith comes from at the other colony. And eventually they have another relative, and he's involved in the Salem witch trials, and that's Samuel Smith. You ever heard of Samuel Smith?
No.
1692. This is one of Joseph Smith's relatives that was involved in the Salem witch trials. He brought charges against a woman named Mary Easty. And this is document. You can look this stuff up. And the Salem witch trials. That she was a witch.
Okay. Like there was no specifics. It's crazy.
No, but it turns out that it's family stuff, all intermarriages and stuff when you go behind the scenes. That's what a lot of it is, So right there, we have something on the screen. This is 1705. So in the time period we were talking about the colonies before, this is about 100 years before that. They show up on the shores and made their colonies. And now they've decided to make a system of colleges, and they got a royal charter for the colonies, and it's called Dartmouth, and this is the Ivy League. You've heard of the Ivy League?
Yeah. Isn't that
You
like
know,
Yale and Harvard as well? Or
yeah. It's 9 colleges
okay.
there that are royal charters that are there to expand and teach the royal Masonic curriculum. And Vox clamantis in deserto. Their motto means a voice screaming in the wilderness. Because part of Dartmouth's one of the mottos, or one of the things it was supposed to do, was to pacify the Indians or spread the gospel to the Indians.
Wild. And that just seems to me so esoteric, you know?
Yeah. And so here is where we're going to get into Mormonism. Well, we're at we're already 20 minutes in, and people are like, I thought you guys were going to talk about Mormonism. Well, now we're going to talk about Mormonism. 1769, at Dartmouth College, you have Joseph Smith's grandfather's cousin is the first professor, the pastor, and giving a series of sermons, and writes the United States' first unabridged Hebrew book, and teaches classes on Chaldaic and Babylonian studies. All the theology and all the stuff that ends up in the Book of Mormon comes from his kinfolk right here at Dartmouth College. And you'll say, well, how is he connected to that? Well, not at a certain point, the family moves 4 miles next to Dartmouth. Mind you, he's born, 14 miles away from Dartmouth. And the brother, Hiram, the intellectual one of the family, attends Dartmouth for 4 years.
Right. Like, this is a weird period in Smith's life because, there's so little talked about at this period. They moved to that area of New York. He winds up breaking his leg. He spends 4 years in bed. His brother goes to the college and tutors him at this time. Isn't that what's going on?
So, all right. So we're going to unpack that story even more. His brother goes to the college for 4 years and is studying with his relative, his grandfather's cousin, and he's studying Hebrew studies, Chaldaic studies, Babylonian studies, Hebrew. I mean, all the stuff that's going to end up in the Book of Mormon, all this stuff. And you say Joseph hurt his leg, and he did hurt his leg. Form of typhoid fever. I think that's what happened to his shin bone. Let's hit the next picture. Because the person that does the surgery for him, well, even right there, that's just a copy, just to show you, of the book of Hebrew grammar by his grandfather's cousin, Joseph Smith. This is at Dartmouth. This is the guy who's at that time teaching all this information. And part of his teachings was to pacify and teach the Indians. He set up something called the School of Prophets. Everything you're going to see in Mormonism comes from his great whatever uncle, whatever you call him. So let's hit the next picture.
Family.
Yeah.
That's so wild.
So who fixes legs? Who does the surgery? Dr. Nathan Smith, the head of the medical department at Dartmouth.
Amazing.
4 miles away, comes over and fixes his leg. The Smith family's connected. We were talking about the Smiths. That's why I'm talking about the Smiths. There's a lot of Smiths involved in this. Nathan Smith isn't related to them, but John Smith is. That's, like I said, the grandfather's cousin. That sets up all this stuff. The main pastor, everything. And here they fix his leg. And why he's in bed for 4 years infirming, his brother is at Dartmouth College studying all this esoteric stuff in the Great Awakening and the continuation of the Royal Charter from Lincolnshire. Just the revolution in 1776 changed that little.
Right.
And so
when I've been looking into this, I know that Joseph and Hiram become extraordinarily close at this time because Hiram spent a lot of his free time tending to Joseph Smith while he was bedridden and tutoring him, lecturing him.
Yeah. Lecturing him. He would go to school in the day at Dartmouth and come home and teach Joseph all the same curriculum from their relative at Dartmouth. concerning Hebrew grammar, Chaldean studies, Masonic stuff, everything. It's all packaged up. This is where you're going to get it from.
And you know me, as soon as you started to tell me this stuff about Dartmouth, I started to go digging around into the library at Dartmouth and what they would have had back then at the turn of the 1800s, 1810s, when the Smiths were attending. And they got a lot of crazy esoteric books that Hiram could have had access to, right? Like there's the Magus, which is basically kind of like a plagiarism of Agrippa's occult philosophies. But when we look at that, you can see almost verbatim what later on becomes that Lamin. You know, like Smith has all these lamins, these parchments of paper that have like sigils to Jupiter on them, sigils to Mars. But a lot of this esoteric imagery is coming from this book, the Magus. Or it could also be coming, there was another book I noticed that was there, and Dan Vogel mentions this one in his work, is The Occult Sciences by Ebenezer Shelby. You know, so it's like the Smiths kind of treasure hunting, their magic, which hasn't even started yet. You know, all of these ideas are formulated at Dartmouth. You know, this is where they're getting introduced into magic, occultism, Chaldean stuff, Hebrew stuff. You know, when we were thinking about it, there's always these kind of like, a lot of people want to talk about the 5 sort of pillars of Mormon thought, right? You have kind of Protestant Christianity, we have Islam, right? We have the occultism kind of stuff that's going on. And then, I'm trying to remember now, we have the occultism, Protestant Christianity, Islam, a Masonry, and then there's one more. That's
Native American.
Native American, the Native American stuff. And when you take all 5 together is when you get the whole, basically, Mormonism. And Dartmouth seems to be the key to this, because that's where you can find references to all 5 of these philosophies.
Though, if I could correct you, the occult part is the Masonic part, and the missing element is Greek.
Oh, right, the Greek myths. Sorry.
So it's Protestant, it's Greek, it's Islam, it's Mason, and Native American.
Right. Incredible, right? And all of this is available to the Smiths at Dartmouth College.
And, you know, one of the reasons they end up there, about 1802, the father is involved in a business that goes wrong. What he was trying to do was export crystallized ginseng to China.
So this seems so wild to me when you first told me this, because I'm like, crystallized ginseng, so that's ginseng that's been processed for use in Chinese medicine.
Oh yeah,
that's some deep magic there. So even Smith Senior, and like this is Asian magic. These guys are connected and are interested.
Right, and this is different than Zangin. You heard of Zangin? Zangin is when you go picking ginseng, which that's just, you know, whatever, the poor folks up in the mountains. No, this is different. He was taking bulk ginseng and crystallizing it into a form, it's an alchemical transaction that's happening there, transformation. You know, it's dealing with roots and herbs and different things. And, you know, there's more to how their family's tied to this. So he has the surgery. Hiram graduates through the 4-year program, whereas his grandfather's cousins teaching everything that they're into. And even there at Dartmouth, they got a giant church with a steeple looking just like Lincolnshire. Like that image of this giant pervading church that controls you is always there in the background, you know, with the big steeple. So let's hit the next picture.
Right.
You know, so he gets better, 4 years, and about what, let's say 1820, you know.
Around that time, but yeah, because Smith Sr. goes bankrupt because his ginseng gets robbed, right, by pirates.
That was earlier. So they managed to try to get a farm.
Yeah, they moved to Palmyra, right?
Yeah, and you have Alvin. You know, the brother Alvin that dies. People don't know about his brother. See, the father, after the ginseng episode and losing everything, was not the head of the family. It was Alvin. Alvin takes over as like the mature one, but then Alvin dies, and Alvin dies because someone gives him some colonial, and colonial is like a mercury. So they used to do like mineral medicines back then. We talk about the different stone medicines they take, and this is one of those things they took, and it killed them. And at that point, it was hard for the Smith family to recover.
Oh, sorry.
You know? Oh, yeah. And what I was saying, it was hard for the Smith family to recover. And it's at that point they turned to that treasure hunting stuff.
Yeah.
And so part of the thing with the treasure hunting, so you know, in New England, there's a series of these stone caverns, hundreds of them, which are like dug with stone walls. And then some people say they're just root cellars. Some of them are aligned to the solstices. Wow. They deal with the Native Americans. So there's mounds and treasure and Captain Kidd's treasure. And so the father is like, yo, is going treasure hunting at this point and gets the family involved in it. Like, you know, they're not making money, that they can't pay the note on the title to the farm. And they move around a lot. And they start digging on the side of hills.
Yeah, when I was looking into this, Smith Sr., his wife's family gives him some land near Palmyra, so they're able to move there. You know, Alvin becomes, like you said, the dominant Smith, because at this time, Joseph Smith Sr. is an alcoholic. You know, he's barely a functioning alcoholic, you know, and he gets him involved in the treasure hunting. And Alvin and Smith and Hiram, they're all involved in it too, but it really is Joseph Smith Sr., and he's obsessed with this Captain Kidd treasure, right? Mm-hmm. And they're looking at all these mounds around, you know, because there are thousands of these mounds all across New England that have been built, right, by the Native Americans. And the people there, they got all these ridiculous stories about them because they don't want to believe there's such an extraordinary level of racism as prevalent at this time that the people do not want to believe that the current indigenous people could have made them, right? Like that's an ongoing theme where it was probably built by a former white indigenous population that was displaced, you know? And this is where you start to get a lot of those myths about the lost tribe of the Israelites coming here.
The Lamanites.
Right.
Yeah, they have a term for them. Well, he's doing his treasure hunting thing, you know, and he would wear glasses. He had stones. He would look into his hat and look at a rock. Sometimes they would steal things from people and hide it and then charge them to find it. You know, it's a whole big thing in New England with these seers and psychics. So finally, at that place right there, Cumorah Hill, 1823, he says he's visited by the angel Moroni and he finds plates, a series of gold plates with ancient writings on them and some glasses that he can interpret the plates. But no one ever sees the plates, mind you. He always has them wrapped up in a cloth. You could only feel them.
Right. I have heard this story, and he claims that the plates are written in a form of he calls it Reformed Egyptian, you know, and I know at one point he even writes down these characters and apparently gives them to Martin Harris, who's one of the witnesses. You know, in the original 3 witnesses, he allows them to touch the plates, but they have to touch the plates through a piece of silk. And then later on, he doesn't even allow them to touch them. He basically gets them to envision the experience in their mind eye. And he says that the angel Moroni presents the plates to them, but it's kind of like a mystical experience, not a physical one.
He made them sign depositions saying that you later, posthumously or whatever. So, you know, let's hit the next pick.
And they change over time because in the earliest ones, they talk about how he's using the seer stone. And then later on, now he's using the glasses. So It's like there's conflicting accounts of how it was even interpreted. So,
you know, those mounds that they were, you know, in New England mounds, one of the names for them, besides being mounds or dolmens, some of them, they call them beehives.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this thing on the screen is also called a beehive. It's called a Liahona. And it comes from, it's the Book of Mormon. They talk about an astrolabe that he found at this is a recreation of the device that was supposedly found at Cumorah Hill, along with the plates and the glasses, was an astrolabe for navigating. And this goes back to Lehi and the Book of Mormon, and it's beehives, more beehive stuff.
Crazy. That's
Yeah,
so interesting.
And let's hit the next picture. So those glasses, Urim and Thummim, obviously I don't say it right, were supposedly two goggles, but they're supposedly gemstones in the real Hebrew tradition. Somehow those become his glasses.
Yeah, in the ancient, it's confusing because in the Hebrew tradition, there's all this stuff, and I'm no expert, but as far as I understand, it's like they were worn on a piece of
Breastplate.
like lead breastplate, and then they would be removed and be tossed, kind of like bones, and then they would scry what they would say,
Yeah, yeah, and
very different
supposedly,
than how Smith is using them.
well, supposedly he would wear a breastplate too, and go behind a screen. He would go behind like a fabric screen, and that's when he would put on the glasses and the breastplate and do all of his hoo-ha
Interesting.
to repackage up his grandfather's cousin's theology.
Wild.
Yeah, so let's hit the next pick.
Who's this?
F.G. Williams. And what's weird about that time, he's also arrested. Joseph Smith, when he went to jail with his brother, that wasn't the first time.
No, yeah. He has a trial for treasure hunting, doesn't he?
Yeah, for treasure hunting, he robbed somebody. And the guy and the affidavit called Joseph Smith the glass looker.
Yeah, there's a comic book written about this that everyone should check out. It's a lot of fun, The Glass Looker. But yeah, he goes to trial because, and the Mormons try to obscure it because of the Old English. I can't remember the actual law, but yeah, he's basically tried for being a charlatan. And Joseph Smith originally he was going to try and prove that he was a psychic, but the trial for some reason never actually happens. I think it's because he just took off.
Yeah. Interstate problems.
Right.
So this is Dr. Frederick G. Williams. And basically in this episode, we've sequestered Joseph Smith's medical records. And through John Smith at Dartmouth and Frederick Williams here, we can we're privy to a lot of what's going on in Mormonism between all the theology and teachings from Dartmouth and this gentleman that he hooks up with here. Now, this gentleman, his father at the time in Ohio, had the first lumber mill. He was, wealthy. And he became a root doctor. That was his thing. He was a root doctor.
Interesting.
He studied from Thompson, who was a famous Thompsonian medicine. And this guy advertised in the local Ohio newspapers, in different newspapers, because he said he used vegetable medicine as opposed to mineral medicine. And mineral medicine is colonial and stones and bleeding. He didn't want to be a barber. What he wanted to be was a root doctor and using steam baths and sweat lodges, Native American and German medicine.
When I looked into this Thompsonian, it's frontier medicine. And like you said, it's all based around herbs and healthy diets and sweating and things like this. They would be giving you a lot of poultices and different concoctions to make you vomit often, try to balance the humors and things like this. Yeah, interesting. And the fact that they don't use metals, that's really telling, right? Like, we know that mercury poison is what killed poor Alvin, And
he even advertises, I don't use calomel. He uses herbs that he learned from the Native Americans in Thompson. And he becomes the healthcare practitioner for a lot of the early Mormons in the temple there. And it was his newspaper press that printed up some of the original documents for them and was spreading the message. Wow. They stayed at his house. Joseph Smith stayed at the dude's house. And he also treated something called bachelor's delight. I think we talked about that in the past episode, which was like syphilis. Yeah. And he treated at least 20 to 30 Mormon elite hierarchy, the elders with it. So he had a little juice over him. I watched something about his grandkids, great-great-grandkids were talking about how the father how he had notes, their medical records, and so they could only do so much to him because he knew what was going on. He's like, well, you all got syphilis and VD within the church. He was the one treating it.
Right.
So he knew
Wow.
the dirty secrets, and he had money, and he was a root doctor, and he also could provide a couple other things. Let's hit the next picture.
It also reminds me of a notorious character from later in Joseph Smith's life, Samuel Beckett, who we know for sure was doing abortions for Smith, was treating a bunch of the Mormons for syphilis, and and also providing them with entheogenic oils. At least that was his claim. So these are two different doctors at different periods. One in the Nauvoo period, and now this guy in the early Mormon period. You know,
Yeah, he's the guy. He's the guy who put him onto that. And
Smith always got a
he
root
even
doctor.
advertised in the newspaper he could do abortions. He even gets sued at one point over lobelia poisoning, where he's using expectorants and steam baths. Here on the screen we have wild lettuce and black henbane. All this stuff is available, and they're using, and was part of the medical acumen of the root doctors. So
Like, I can get wild lettuce in my backyard right now. It grows everywhere, and you can easily turn that into a potent painkiller. You
oh yeah,
know,
oh yeah, and that's what I'm saying. So F.G. Williams was a big part of the church, not just in providing their entheogenics, but in treating the church, in his printing press, in his money, in his resources. He
and we got to
treated
remember,
bachelor's delight.
in henbane, this is a source of scopolamine. You
Oh
know,
yeah,
that's an extraordinarily strong deliriant that will produce possible psychosis, but definitely psychedelic visions.
oh they loved it. You know, and another thing is, F.G. Williams was the local judge
Oh
and the
wow!
justice of the peace. Yeah, yeah. You know, he was as confident too for years. Brigham turned on him at a certain point, but they brought him back in. Brigham turns on everybody, obviously, huh? You know, after
Yeah,
everybody dies. So let's hit the next picture. All right. So Joseph Smith makes a religion. What's that? 1830. He writes the Book of Mormon. He has F.G. Williams there. This is all repackaged stuff from John Smith from Dartmouth. Hiram was the intellectual genius. Alvin died, pretended to find treasures from ancient Egypt or wherever. Spoke to the angel, and he was charismatic. This all happens between the time period of 24 years old to about 38 years old. He's a charismatic young guy that just happens to start this religion where he's giving people entheogenics and polygamy, and a lot of them weren't into the polygamy stuff, just so you know. So he dies. Him and his brother die, and part of it, before he dies, they had done something a few years earlier than that, was the Kirkland Safety Bank or Safety Committee. They started a couple banks, and they were printing their own currency. A lot of people don't talk about that. In doing so, they pissed off other bankers as well, and other people. And there's the polygamy stuff as well. People are getting incensed over, and Masonic stuff. So much so that they come get him. They're in jail, and they come get him.
right. No, we'll definitely go into this a lot deeper in a future episode on Nauvoo. But yeah, the idea is that there was a mob. I mean, Joseph Smith was notorious. There was lots of people who hated him. But we know that there were Masons who riled up the mob to go kill him. And they were explicitly mad, the Masons, about him appointing people as master Masons without going through the proper ceremonies and revealing Masonic secrets. And this is a theme. If you look in early America, there are several high-profile murders that are attributed to the Masons because people published books or released letters or other things that the Masons deemed their secrets.
Oh yeah. So, like I said in the last week's episode, you can see he has his Masonic pin, Brigham, on the left here, and they airbrushed that out in later LDS stuff. So the reason I put the picture again this week is Brighamites. Joseph Smith dies, and there's a power vacuum. Brigham wants to be the first president, take over the whole thing. On the right, you have Rigdon, and they're the Rigdonites. And
So,
he feels he's the oldest, so like, hey, I'm older than all you people, and I should be in charge of this.
well, we also have to put things in perspective because Rigdon is one of not the earliest followers, but he's one of the first really important, massive followers that Joseph Smith attracts that really turns Mormonism from like cult into like phenomenon. And that's because Rigdon had his own church, and he was this charismatic preacher in his own right. And throughout Mormon history, he's one of these firebrand guys who gets people riled up. He's somewhat notorious for being part of the spark that caused the Mormon Wars in Illinois because he talks about how the Mormons should be going out and killing the Gentiles, basically. So Sidney Rigdon is a firebrand preacher, an intense guy, and he's also famous for being extraordinarily anti-polygamist. He believes in the sanctity of marriage. This is a huge point for him. But by the time of Nauvoo, Rigdon is old and Rigdon is also ill. And he's not privy to a lot of what's happening in the upper echelons. And Smith has kind of been distancing himself. And actually, at one point, Smith tries to rape Rigdon's daughter. So there's a falling out between them. And Rigdon is kind of pushed away from the upper echelons of Mormon power. And Brigham Young takes his place and becomes the right-hand man to Smith. At least in the public popular conception of the Mormons, of the local people. There's always a bunch of weird people who are connected to Smith who wield power, but Brigham was kind of the face of Mormonism and a face of Mormon success. He's one of the best business minds of his era. It's arguable whether or not the Mormons would have survived without Brigham because he managed to do that whole scheme in England where he's able to get people to America for dirt cheap. He can get you a ticket on a boat and get you here. So by doing that, he's able to set up a constant stream of people coming in, and he's kind of seen as Smith's fixer. He deals with a lot of the shit that Smith does. He's a very aggressive man and a very scary, domineering man,
And so he's the main, let's say, character that takes over in the Power Void. Rigdon doesn't manage to do it, but it'll go down in history. There's several books you can read about the Rigdonites. There's also other sects we're going to talk about. Let's go to the next picture.
Yeah, it's not a clean break. It's not like everyone just sides with Brigham and it's easy for Brigham, Also, Brigham's an extremist, right?
Yeah. So here we have Emma Smith. Emma Smith came from her own family, had her own family history. They wanted to utilize her money. So now with Emma, she wasn't into the polygamy. Joseph Smith's wife wasn't into the polygamy, his first wife. Maybe for a week or two, because she had to, he forced it on her. But she wasn't into that. He invented that stuff just so he can get with anybody he wanted. He can get with somebody's daughter, like Rigdon's daughter, whoever. He could just have a vision and go, hey, the angel wants me to get with your daughter.
Doing a lot of reading into Emma Smith, her story is intense because it seems like I believe she genuinely, truly, madly loved Smith, and that love prevented her from seeing a lot of the extremism that was blatant to everyone else, So Smith was obviously, by the end of his career, just before he dies, Dan Vogel talks about how he was marrying a woman a day, like 30 women a month, and he was traveling around, marry these women, sleep with them, take off and do it again. It was getting insane. And he was marrying like daughters. He even marries a mother and her daughter at one point, but Emma Smith was not privy to a lot of this. Or, it's so complicated and hard for women. You got to understand, she, by marrying Smith, her father, and so the story goes with her father is that Smith comes and convinces her father that he has the ability to see into these mounds with his seer stone. And they set up a company to go do mining in their local area. And while they're working together, he starts wooing his daughter and ripping him off. And, the tale keeps getting bigger and the tale keeps getting bigger. So at first, her father likes him, but, things start to get worse and worse. And the final straw is when Smith says the treasure where it was supposed to be actually fell deeper into another hole that they have to get to. And in order to get to this hole, they have to call off the spirits, these toad spirits. And he says you got to sacrifice a black goat. This pisses him completely off, and he wants nothing more to do with Smith. But Smith at this time is determined to take Emma, and he has Emma head over heels for him. And Emma is a highly educated, powerful woman in her own right. And her family was extraordinarily progressive for its time. She was educated, and she was given a lot of freedom, and even though her family hated it, they allowed her to marry Joseph because that's their daughter. It's not like it would have been easier for her to go home. And then her family winds up dying too. By the time of Nauvoo, when Smith is like ratcheting things up to the insane, it's not like she had family she could ever go back to. There was no other life for her. She was attached to this man. So we got to remember that. She loves him and she's bound by him. There is nowhere for her to run to, so she has to deal with his shit. And he is a prophet of God in the eyes of these people. He can do whatever he wants, and he tries to. It's quite scary.
Well, the research says that she tried to poison him twice.
Yeah. There's all these accusations. At one point, she tries to force him to allow her to marry someone on her own.
Yeah.
To have to so that
multiple husbands.
Yeah, Mormonism almost had, polyandry. And she even Smith was a notorious lech, right? He had a series of bars. He had prostitution houses, but she was fighting him on this all the way. At one point, she creates a temperance league. She has a women's kind of suffragette kind of group. But of course, Smith stacks it with his wives. This is the thing, stacks it with loyal. Smith manipulates everything, right? It's a wild story.
She did, if I'm correct, remarry after he died.
Yep.
To a Protestant minister.
And she does have one son with Smith, Joseph Smith III.
Hey, next picture, please.
Oh yeah, okay.
There he is.
Joseph
in his
Smith
Platonic
III.
post, Joseph Smith III, who was supposed to be a prophet of the RDLS.
Well, this is the thing, right? Because Emma Smith kind of starts her own version of the church as well, right? And it's interesting is that in the early days of Nauvoo, before the splits fully codify, all of the people, Rigdon, Strang, Brigham, they all agree that when Smith III comes of age, he will take on the role of the greater prophet of Mormonism. But, by the time Smith comes of age, no way in hell is Brigham giving up his power. No way in hell. I think Strang is dead by that point. But you know what I mean? Like, none of these guys are going to let him be the prophet. So he becomes a prophet of the RLDS church.
Yeah.
But Emma Smith kind of lies to him and kind of obscures the truth of Smith, of his father to him. Paints like a rose-colored glasses picture of him as a non-polygamist and says all of this horrible stuff about all the other Mormons,
That's funny you said Strang. Let's hit the next picture.
Here's our buddy Strang, the craziest opportunist of all time. His story is so bloody.
You're going to tell his story. That's for you.
We'll do it. I want to do a full episode on Strang to give him his justice because he's such a under talked about figure. But he was a powerful Mason. He was connected to Samuel Beckett, who was a notorious lech and fighter. Like, there's a whole story we got to get into with that later Nauvoo series and stuff. But what's wild about him is that Strang kind of comes in right at the tail end of Smith's life before he dies, and within a few months manages to ingratiate himself all the way to the upper echelons to become one of Smith's closest companions. He's a Danite. He's right next to Brigham Young within months because he's an absolute sycophant, like true believer to the nth degree. But when Smith dies, he constructs his own mythology. He finds his own golden plates on his farm, and he writes his own version of Reformed Egyptian. And then he talks about his own exodus to the promised land,
Wait. Hit the next picture so you can show us the promised land.
Beaver Island. Now, this is something that's like so it's always struck with me because this is in the middle of Lake Michigan. It's like 30 minutes from my house where I live in Sault Ste. Marie in Canada. I'm right off of I'm right near Lake Superior. But famously, they go to this island and he becomes a king. He declares himself king, you know, and he kind of kicks out the local people who already lived there.
Oh,
And he even starts committing piracy, international piracy. He starts raiding Canadian settlements. He starts raiding American settlements because Gentiles were fair game, you know?
oh,
It's such a wild story with Strang, but he saw that because Smith had to keep, or Smith decided to keep the polygamy within the upper echelons. Only the elitist of the elite knew what was going on. You had to be a bishop, you had to be a high priest, you had to be a Danite, you know? So what ends up happening is that still a lot of the people were not into polygamy. They were traditional Protestant Puritan Christians. You know, a lot of these people are coming from England. The idea of polyamory or of these plural marriages is totally insane to them. So Strang, he also sees that Rigdon, who is the kind of the voice of, you know, of one man, one wife and true Christian marriage, he's kind of old and sick. So he takes advantage of the situation and he manages to convince some powerful Mormons at this time to join him, like Samuel Beckett and Martin Harris, who was one of the first people to have witnessed the golden plates. And then he apparently confirms the prophecy, right? So when you have one of the guys who confirmed Smith's original prophecy can confirm Strang's prophecy, people just start to buy into it. And also, like Smith, Strang ratchets things up. He doesn't just declare himself king at first, right? I'm the prophet. I got these plates. Let's go to the promised land in Beaver Island. When they get there, now I'm a king. Now all of a sudden we can do polygamous marriages, even though the whole reason you joined me was so that we wouldn't have polygamous marriages.
now you know
You
the
know?
secret.
And then you Beckett, get the hell out of here, Beckett. You're trying to mess with my power. You Martin Harris, get the hell out of here. You're trying to mess with my power. And then he gets sick and dies. It's kind of a wild, wild story, but we'll get into it more at some point.
I'm telling you, the offshoots inside the Mormon clique is wild.
Oh yeah, and that's not even the most famous, right? Like the FLDS, which happens also around this time, the fundamentalist Mormons, you know. Or sorry, they're a branch off of the Brighamites, but yeah.
And then we're also going to do an episode later on in the future, folks. Is about Warren Jeffries.
Yeah,
You've got so much wild stuff going on in modern times. But let's hit the next pick. All right. So they had some colonies in Mexico, too. They didn't just go to Beaver Island or Utah or Nauvoo or Missouri or Kirtland, Ohio or Palmyra. They went to a lot of spots. But they had problems in Mexico in modern times. Like when we talked about, the cartels would go down there and they took them out. They're not going for that. They're still there, though. And I suspect that the American government backs them just to keep a foothold in Mexico to cause problems.
It's a complicated thing, you know. The Mormons are a gang in their own right, you know, and the Mormons are a corporation. And a lot of the ones that have stayed in Mexico became FLDS, you know, or there's weird offshoots like, you know, it's complicated.
Church of Zion. They have one Church of Zion. They have different ones.
Mitt Romney's family originates from these Mexican colonies, right?
Yeah.
One of the probably the most powerful Mormon in modern history, you know, at least on an individual scale.
Snappy question for you. There's a frog that comes from Sonora right there. What's the name of the Sonoran frog?
I'm not sure. What is it? Sonoran frog?
It's called the bufo toad.
No kidding.
Yeah. That's the bufo. Bufo avalaris. It's Sonora. It's famous. People go down to Sonora to lick the toads.
Wow. I thought that was much further south.
No, they also have that down in you can get the toad all the way down to South America.
Yeah, for sure.
But Sonora has the toads and the red ants and the peyote and the salvia divinorum.
And we know they're doing all of them. right?
And they also got psilocybin, and they also got the morning glory, and they also got the Egyptian, and they also got the calamus, of course, calamus. They got a lot of stuff. There's this one Aztec statue that has like 20 different psychoactives on it,
Of
and in
course.
holding the posture, like
Right.
one of those postures as well.
Yeah,
You know, so
we've talked a lot about that, the psychedelic postures, right? And sound driving.
oh yeah, and so next picture. Oh yeah, so another. So we talked about Brighamites, Rigdonites, Strongites, um, Emma Smith's branch with the RDLS,
RLDS.
FDLS, Church of Zion. Okay, so Amasa, we talked about Amasa in previous episodes. This is the guy that went down and founded New Zion in California. Remember, originally it wasn't Utah. This was all supposed to be in California under the Arrowhead at a special spot that natives had. Like, this is a Native American. This has all, if you understand San Bernardino and all the elements, that was the culmination. It could have been all the elements at play in the story. Everything was going to happen.
And Amasa was such an interesting character because weren't you telling me like he was infamous within the Mormon church for downplaying the Book of Mormon, downplaying the Bible, and actually talking a lot about spiritism of the time and using entheogens to contact spirits, right? Wasn't that his whole bag?
Yes, and the thing is, when he joined originally, he's known as the 13th apostle originally, before Joseph dies. Because Joseph had his 12 apostles, like the 12 knights of King Arthur. You know, he had his thing, the Quamaran. And that's what Orson Pratt's kicked out. But then Orson Pratt comes back, so they have to kick Amos out because he's the youngest member. And they call him the 13th disciple. But to give him some kind of position, they say, well, you could be the assistant to the first presidency. Meaning, if Joseph Smith were to die, he would take over. And people even commented on that he had to say something like, no, don't worry. He has to say that. So there's at least 4 instances that's published that talks about him to be the new leader of Mormonism, the real leader, because he was teaching something different. So he got busted in Scotland by Brigham Young because he published a sermon telling him that you need to be have moral character. You don't need the angel Moroni. You need to have moral character, be a good person, and you can contact the dead and do seances and spiritism and root vegetables. You know, on the right is Partridge, Maria Eliza Partridge. That's Joseph Smith's wife, widow, remarried Amasa. Emma Smith takes off and she marries Amasa. You know, and he's the one that took it to Europe first. He's the one that took all that to back to England and all that stuff, Scotland and all that. And so eventually he goes down and founds the San Bernardino colony, which is very special that we talked about. And Brigham gets mad over a lot of things, has the Mormon recall. He wants to fight with them, you know, to build Deseret. And he is the Mormon recall. They do the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which we've talked about, where Mormons dress up as Native Americans and slaughter people coming to California around the gold rush time, and Mormons escaping Brigham Young in Utah, Danites. You know, since we're talking about, you know, so let's go to the next picture.
Wow.
We'll explain more of this. We'll unpack it a little more. That's the plan for San Bernardino Fort. It's a temple square based on this ancient Egyptian stuff. And that's in San Bernardino. That's a holograph of Salt Lake City, is the same design. Just Brigham was there with all the power, making all that money, and had all of his wives. And said, yeah, you got to leave paradise and come back to hell because we're making the beehive. Basically what happened, you know. And part of that was the Danites, because you talked about the Danites. You know, let's hit the next picture.
Yeah, the Danites, so people understand, were Joseph Smith's sort of secret police in many ways. You know?
Yeah. So that's the Mormon Rocks in California. And that the railroad right there is going to Barstow Station, which is a Masonic railroad station that even had a cornerstone ceremony with a Masonic parade back in the day. You know, in this Mormon city. It was very special. You could find so much occulted history there. And these are called the Mormon Rocks of California. But let's hit the next picture. And the Mormons stayed there as they were passing through. It was called also chanting rocks by the Native Americans because when the wind would blow through there, it's very windy out there. It makes it like a humming sound with those holes in the rocks. And it's a very eerie sound. It's called the chanting rocks or Mormon rocks. And that's part of one of the original places the Mormons stayed. They also did found San Bernardino, Las Vegas on the way. Yeah, through the Mormon corridor.
So the mob is later.
You know, a lot of the history deals with the Mormons originally. They just all got Brigham ended it all. See, Mormon history is so occulted. It takes layers of the onion to unpeel just to find it. So let's go to the next picture. So all the Mormons have to pass through that spot when they're leaving the Arrowhead in California paradise to go back to Utah. You know, where a lot of them were murdered that tried to escape the Mountain Meadows massacre by Danites. Here's a picture of some Danites. There's a thing called dime store novels. I don't know if you ever heard of that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and they had these Wild West stories and comics. These are the original comics. And there's several episodes that talk about the Danites. Look at very KKK-ish.
Well, yeah, why do they got the white pointed hats on?
Yeah, you know, because that's what they wore. And they're going after the native or after the woman, kidnapping women. That's what they like. You notice it takes 10 of them to get one woman? Come on.
That's so ridiculous.
But they're wearing the colors, though. They have the red and white. Remember we talk about our colors, the dyeing guilds, and we see the blue there, and you see the reds and whites. And so you'd have these not Pinkertons. I don't know if you know. Do you even know what Pinkertons are? This is Americana stuff.
Yeah, Pinkertons were like a police force for the colonies, and
they had these long pistols and overcoats, and there's a lot of
like mercenaries, police for hire.
Yeah, so you had to get some like Pinkerton types to fight the Danites, and supposedly Mormon history will tell you, well, the Danites that was like for 6 months. That was all they were just set up to protect us from the bad people trying to hurt us. You know, but the Danites were evil. They were crazy. They would burn down newspapers, kidnap people, assassinate other Mormons that spoke out, dress up as Native Americans to slaughter women and children trying to escape Brigham Young. That's who they are. The Danites.
The Danites, yeah, they would commit raids. Like back in Illinois, they would commit raids on their neighbors. And famously, Orrin Porter Rockwell tried to assassinate Boggs, the I can't remember what you call it, the head of state for Illinois.
The governor of Missouri.
Yeah, he tried to assassinate the governor. Like,
Orrin Rockwell. Yeah, there's a few of these guys, and so you know, amongst opening this investigation into Mormons, you know, getting deep into it, like I got these names in my head now: Oliver Cowdery, Orson Pratt, Arthur Pratt, F.G. Williams, Brigham Young, Beckett, all the Smiths. There's Amasa Lyman, Rigdon, Strong. There's so many of them, and I'm learning who they are. These players in this
American characters, right?
Yeah, this great awakening, this cult game that they set up shop in Utah. Now, like I said, it's failed. Let's get the next picture. So that's the Temple Square in Utah, where Brigham set up shop. And notice they got that church like that other church we showed you.
Say, doesn't that look like the church in Lincolnshire, except it's got 3 and 2?
Yeah, that big imposing church there, you know. They always got that. That's his thing. He wants to build a big imposing church from Lincolnshire. And that Temple Square is based on the same design in San Bernardino, Masonic grid. You know, and this is the power structure out of Utah started with the Temple Square, where the city is designed, connected. You know, it's the separation of church and state. Utah is the opposite. It's an opposite experiment. And no, church and state is connected. So much so in a Masonic order in the middle of Utah. And there's no natives there because they genocided them. Wherever they went, they genocided them. And even though, what was it? Vox clamantis in deserto, a voice in the wilderness to help the Indians, eventually end up genociding the Indians.
Well,
and
you know,
stealing their myths and genociding them.
Right. You know? It's a classic insane, you know, the Puritans had this, like they have this thing where at one hand they have to indoctrinate and convert the natives, because the natives are the original lost tribe and all this stuff. But then when the natives just thoroughly reject them and call them insane, that they can't handle that rejection. So that causes like an extreme backlash of insane violence, and like they still to this day try to proselytize like crazy among the Native Americans. They try to adopt their children. It's like it's such a weird thing. You were showing us in the last episode they had to the state had to get involved to get them to stop doing that silly Camorra festival where they talk about going to spread the gospel to the natives. It's so offensive, but they shroud it in their religion, so therefore it's all good. But at the heart is this insane idea that unless people are civilized, unless they submit to the will of Christ in our interpretation, they're doomed to the hellfire.
And you know what's wild? Like you take that Temple Square right there and you walk miles out in any direction, you have millions of people that are following this ancient, it's not ancient, this religion that Joseph Smith made up. And that's one thing, if you want to follow religion. But now this is governmental, this is state, this is city, this is the mayor's office. They have laws in the books about anal sex, about all kinds of shit that's different than other states in America. They have rules there that are completely different. That's based on this made up shit.
And you know what? The most insidious part about the Mormon Church is that, like we said earlier, they're a massive corporation with massive pockets, and they have an invested interest on controlling the rest of us.
How much? How much are these massive pockets? How much are these massive pockets?
32 billion.
That's right. They got sued recently in the past couple of years because they've been hiding 32 billion in assets. And it's been systemic. This has been going on since the 1900s. Up to now, they've managed to accumulate and hide 13 billion there. And so they taxed them. The government's like, you got to at least give us something. You got to give us a percentage. Come on now.
I love it. And in the Mormon Church, like they've evolved too, and they're insidious. Like we can't just talk about them in America anymore. They're a global institution, and a lot of the shit they're causing is in Africa. Like they're one of the biggest proponents of a lot of anti-gay propaganda across the world. They're spending billions of dollars on the Trump and DeSantis campaigns. They tried to get freaking Mitt Romney elected, right? They got also the largest stockpiles of food on the planet. The largest on the planet, waiting for their apocalypse, which they're trying to instigate as well.
Well, they already got enough. They got everything ready, so it's like it's time to start the party. The bar is fully stocked. So with that said, we need you to like. Joseph says like. Joseph says subscribe. Joseph says you have to comment. And the Angel Morani wants you to share this with all your friends.
Right.
Otherwise, I'm going to seal you all as my wives and for perpetuity. And we're going to live on planet Saturn. You don't want that.
Baptize you without your consents, and you'll spend your eternity in Mormon heaven.
Non-consensual silly. Yeah. What's up with that? So in the next episode of when we get it could be next week or it could be the following week. But it's coming up soon. We'll explore Warren Jeffries, what's the different Mormon sects that kidnap people, modern Mormon stuff, and how this affects you. And people reach out to us because we'd love to have somebody guest, one of our Mormon friends, to share their testimonials and come on and tell us about this stuff. If there's things that you know about, and male, female, bad, good, we just want to hear your experiences from the inside.
This is an ongoing thing. There are millions of Mormons there. This is our culture here in North America, and we want to talk to people who have had to experience this, and we want to know your perspectives, because it's one thing for us to talk about this as outsiders and to present you our research, but lived experiences is a whole other reality. And one of the big things we like to talk about and highlight on Occult Explorers is what people actually believe. It's not so much about the academic or the literal truth. Like, at the end of the day, I don't care what the Bible actually says. What matters is what people believe and use it to justify, you know? So that's what we want to do here. We want to get your perspectives. We want to get your opinions. And if you don't feel comfortable coming on, you send us in a video testimonial, or you can send us in a written testimonial that I can
you don't have
write.
to show your face or nothing. Yeah, we would love that, because I've been to Utah once. I made it a point to go there when I was in Colorado. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go through Utah and spend the night there and just have some fun, try to have an adventure. And so I did go there, and I stayed in that grid area. It was weird. And all the streets were laid out very square. It was like very depressing and weird. That's all I can say. That's all I can say. I did have fun, though.
But yeah, so reach out to us. You can get in contact to us either through YouTube. Our email is listed there, as well as through the Discord. Both Dion and I are on there almost all the time. And yeah, so thank you guys all for tuning in. And peace and love. And any last words there?
Anything going on tomorrow?
Oh, yeah. So tomorrow we're going to be doing a witches symposium. Neil's on vacation at the moment, so please give Neil some love. He's taking a little bit of a relaxation. Will join us next week. But Dion and I and Rech, as well as Dr. Ammon, will be there to discuss Slavic magic. And we're going to be doing a lot of comparison. We're going to be comparing the Slavic traditions to a lot of the areas around it. So, and a lot of how the Greeks talk about the Slavic traditions. It's super interesting.
Medea.
What's sorry?
Medea.
Oh, yeah. You know what we're talking about. We're talking snakes and snake mothers, right? Makosh, Medea. And, they got all these baptism rites going on. And I've been talking to one of the people who had been watching our show and learning some more about some Slavic stuff. So it's going to be some interesting, there was a big Slavic festival on July the 7th, I believe.
Is that Kupala?
Kupala. Yeah. So, it's going to be a fun one. I hope to see you guys all there. And that'll be Sunday, 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. California time. So any last words, Dion?
Have a blessed week. Have fun.
All right, everyone. And you know the drill. Peace, love, and hail Satan. Till next time.